Tejo stood in the Great Hall of the Galactic Council. The massive room stretched far beyond what human eyes could see clearly. Thousands of alien beings filled the floating platforms that circled the central speaking area. Some looked like walking crystals that sang when they moved. Others had too many arms or eyes that glowed in colors humans had no names for. He had been Earth's ambassador for 5 years now. 5 long years of being treated like a child among adults. The other species in the galaxy were old. Some had been traveling between stars when humans were still learning to make fire. The youngest alien race had been building cities when Earth's dinosaurs walked the planet. Today felt different, though. Tejo carried reports that made his hands shake. He had read them over and over during the long trip to the Council world. Each time they made less sense but felt more real. Council Prime Vexthara floated above them all. Her crystal body caught the light from 3 different suns and threw rainbows across the hall. When she spoke, her voice sounded like wind chimes in a storm. "The human requests to speak," she announced. Her tone made it clear what she thought about that. Ambassador Tejo of the 3rd planet of the Sol system. Tejo walked to the center platform. The gravity here was lighter than Earth, so he had to be careful not to bounce with each step. Around him, thousands of alien eyes watched. Some beings whispered to each other in languages that sounded like music or grinding stone. "Honored Council," Tejo began. His voice carried across the hall through translation devices that turned his words into whatever language each listener needed. "I come with urgent news from human space. Our deep space sensors have detected something at the edge of our galaxy." A sound like laughter filled the hall, but it came from beings that had no mouths. Tejo waited for it to stop. "We have found large objects moving in the dark between galaxies. These objects match descriptions found in our oldest stories and myths, stories about creatures that destroy worlds and eat stars." Now the laughter was louder. Even Council Prime Vexthara's crystal body seemed to dim with what might have been amusement. "Myths?" asked Ambassador Crystal, whose people looked like giant insects made of metal. "The human speaks of children's stories?" "Yes," Tejo said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But these are not just any stories. Every human culture has them. Stories about dragons that breathe fire hot enough to melt mountains. Demons that can walk through walls and steal souls. Beasts so terrible that seeing them drives people mad." The hall erupted in sounds that might have been alien laughter. Some beings made clicking noises. Others hummed in patterns that hurt Tejo's ears. Council Prime Vexthara raised one crystalline arm for silence. "Ambassador Tejo, your species has existed for what? 50,000 years? Our records go back millions of years. Some of us were here when your sun was still forming. Do you really think your brief existence has taught you something we do not know?" Tejo felt heat rise in his face. This was exactly what he had expected, but it still stung. "The patterns match perfectly. The energy signatures, the movement. Patterns, even the shapes we can make out. They look exactly like the monsters from our oldest stories." "Stories," repeated Ambassador Thavek, whose people were famous for their logic. "Imaginary tales told to frighten children. This is your evidence? Not just stories," Tejo insisted. He activated his datapad and shared the information with the council systems. Images appeared in the air above the central platform. "These are the readings our sensors picked up. Look at them." Really look. The images showed dark shapes moving against the stars. They were huge, larger than most space stations. But there was something wrong about them. They seemed to bend light around themselves. Some appeared to have wings. Others looked like they were covered in scales or had too many legs. "Sensor errors," said Council Prime Vexthara dismissively. "Or perhaps your primitive equipment cannot properly interpret what it sees." Meanwhile, far from the council hall, Dr. Myung sat in her laboratory on Earth. She was one of the few humans who studied alien archaeology. Most of her work involved trying to understand the ruins that older species had left behind on dead worlds, but today she was looking at human artifacts. Very old human artifacts. things that should not exist. Her partner Dongjun worked at another table. He was a language expert who could read scripts that most humans had forgotten existed. Together they had been studying cave paintings, stone tablets, and metal objects that seemed far too advanced for when they were supposed to have been made. "This doesn't make sense," Mi Young said, staring at a stone tablet covered in symbols. "These markings describe creatures that sound exactly like what our sensors detected in deep space." Dongjun looked up from his own work. "I found something similar in these Sanskrit texts. But Mi Young, these writings are thousands of years old. How could ancient humans know about creatures in space?" Mi Young showed him her tablet. The symbols seemed to move in the light, almost like they were alive. "Look at this word here. In 12 different ancient languages, it means the sleepers, and this one means the first war. But according to our history, humans never had any first war with aliens. Because we never met aliens until 300 years ago," Dongjun said, but he sounded less sure than he usually did. "What if we're wrong?" Mi Young asked quietly. "What if humans have encountered these things before?" Back at the Galactic Council, Taeho was still trying to convince the assembled aliens to take his warning seriously. But he could see it was hopeless. They had decided he was just a worried human seeing monsters in shadows. "Even if these objects were real," said Ambassador Yilsha, "whose people had never lost a war in 10,000 years, what could they do against us? We have fleets that can crack planets, weapons that can make stars go cold, shields that have never been broken." "The myths say these things are different," Taeho said desperately. "They don't fight like normal enemies. They change reality itself. They make the impossible happen." "Enough," Council Prime Vexthara said. Her voice cut through the hall like ice. "Ambassador Taeho, return to your people. Tell them the Council appreciates their concern, but we do not make policy based on fairy tales." Taeho felt something cold settle in his stomach. He bowed formally and turned to leave. As he walked away, he could hear the aliens already moving on to other business. To them, humanity's warning was just entertainment, but as Taeho reached the exit, every alarm in the council building began to scream. Emergency lights bathed the hall in red. The great displays around the room lit up with incoming data. From the edge of the galaxy, long-range sensors had detected something new. Massive structures, dark and ancient, had begun to move. They were coming from the space between galaxies, from the cold dark where nothing should exist, and as the first clear images appeared on the displays, every being in the council hall fell silent. The objects in the pictures looked exactly like the creatures from humanity's oldest nightmares. Taeho stopped at the doorway and turned back. "I told you so," he said quietly. But his voice carried in the sudden silence, and everyone heard him. The galaxy's oldest and most powerful species stared at the displays in shock. For the first time in millions of years, they had encountered something their vast knowledge and experience could not explain, but humanity's myths could. The messages came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Every species in the galaxy with advanced sensors began picking up strange signals from deep space. The transmissions seemed to move through normal space, then disappear, then reappear somewhere else entirely. The crystalline collective tried to decode the signals first. Their computer minds could process information faster than most organic brains could think. But after 3 days of analysis, they admitted defeat. The signals made no sense. They followed no known patterns of mathematics or physics. The Mechanical Union joined the effort next. Their artificial intelligence networks were so advanced, they had achieved something close to godhood in the digital realm. But the signals seemed to slip through their processing like water through a net. Every time they thought they had found a pattern, it changed. Dr. Mi Young heard about the failed attempts while she was still working on the ancient artifacts in her Earth laboratory. Something made her request copies of the alien signals. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way the old stone tablets seemed to whisper in the dark. When the data arrived, she almost deleted it immediately. The files hurt to look at. Not physically, but in some deeper way. They made her feel like something was watching. her from very far away, but Dongjin noticed something the alien computers had missed. "Mi Young, look at this," he said, pointing at patterns in the signal data. "See these wave formations? They're not random. They follow the same rhythm as some of these ancient human texts." Mi Young leaned over his shoulder. The signals did look familiar, but not in any way that made sense. "Show me," she said. Dongjin pulled up a Sanskrit manuscript they had been studying. It was supposed to be a religious text about the end of the world. But when he placed the signal patterns next to the text structure, they matched. "This can't be right," Mi Young whispered. "This manuscript is over 3,000 years old." "Try this one," Dongjin said, pulling up an even older text. This one was carved on stone tablets found in a cave in South Korea. The symbols were so old that no one had been able to translate them completely until now, when Mi Young ran the signal patterns through her translation program, using the rhythm and structure of the ancient text, words began to appear on her screen. Not Korean words, not Sanskrit, but something older. Something that felt like it came from before human civilization began. "The sleepers wake," the translation read. "The first hunt begins again. The children of the last war will remember, or all will be consumed." Mi Young stared at the screen. "Dongjin, what if these signals aren't from aliens at all? What if they're meant for us?" Captain Jae-wook commanded the human defense fleet stationed at New Seoul Colony. It wasn't much of a fleet, just 12 ships and about 3,000 crew members. The Galactic Council had insisted that humanity didn't need a large military. After all, the galaxy was peaceful, and stronger species would protect the weaker. Jae-wook had never believed that, but he kept his opinions to himself. His job was to watch the space around the colony and report anything unusual. Today, unusual didn't begin to cover what his sensors were showing him. "Captain," called Sojin from the sensor station. She was young for her position, but she had the best eyes in the fleet for reading energy patterns. "I'm getting readings that don't make sense." "Show me," Jae-wook said, moving to look over her shoulder. The display showed space around New Seoul Colony. Everything looked normal at first. Stars, planets, the usual background radiation that filled all of space. But then Sojin highlighted some readings that made Jae-wook's blood run cold. "These gravity waves," she said, pointing at the data. "They're not coming from any normal source. They're too regular, too organized. And Captain, they match something from our database." "What kind of match?" Jae-wook asked, though he was afraid he already knew. Sojin pulled up another file. This one was from Earth's historical archives. It showed a carved stone relief from an ancient Norwegian church. The carving depicted a massive serpent wrapped around the world, so large it could swallow planets. "The gravity patterns match the movement described in this myth," Sojin said quietly. "Something huge is moving out there, Captain. Something that moves like the World Eater from the old stories." Jae-wook stared at the comparison. The scientific readings and the ancient carving told the same story. Something enormous was swimming through space itself, bending gravity around it like water around a sea monster. "Send this to Confederate Command immediately," he ordered, but when the report reached Confederate military headquarters, Admiral Zix Mora dismissed it without a second thought. The Draconis Empire had been warriors for 1,000,000 years. They had conquered galaxies and fought battles that lasted centuries. They were not going to be frightened by human ghost stories. "Transfer Captain Jae-wook to patrol duty in the Outer Rim," the Admiral ordered. Clearly the pressure of command is affecting his judgment. Back on Earth, elderly historian Haewon was having the strangest day of her very long career. She had been given special permission to examine documents in the Vatican's secret archives. Most scholars never got such access, but her research into ancient human migrations had impressed the Church authorities. What she found there changed everything she thought she knew about human history. The documents were old beyond measure. Some were written on materials that shouldn't have existed when they were supposedly created. Others were covered in symbols that looked almost human, but not quite right. One manuscript, written in Latin but containing words from much older languages, told a story that made HFY question her sanity. According to the text, humans had not evolved on Earth. They had come from somewhere else, fleeing a war so terrible that it had destroyed entire galaxies. The survivors had hidden on Earth, a remote world far from the battlefields, but the most disturbing part was the description of their enemies. A manuscript called them the First Ones, or those who hunger. It described creatures that could not be killed by normal weapons, beings that fed on reality itself. The descriptions matched human myths about demons, dragons, and apocalyptic beasts with perfect accuracy. "But this is impossible," HFY whispered to herself as she read. "Humans have been on Earth for millions of years. We evolved here." Then she found another document. This one was newer, maybe only a few hundred years old. It was a report from a Catholic missionary who had been sent to study indigenous cultures around the world. The missionary had found the same stories everywhere. Every human culture, no matter how isolated, had myths about the same creatures, the same war, the same flight to safety. "It is as if," the missionary had written, "all of humanity carries the memory of some great terror. A terror so profound that it has been passed down through every generation and every culture since the beginning of human time." HFY closed the manuscript with shaking hands. If these documents were real, then human history was a lie. Humanity wasn't a young species learning to explore space. They were refugees who had been hiding for so long they had forgotten what they were hiding from. The first scout ship disappeared on a Tuesday. It was a routine patrol vessel from the Mechanical Union, checking on automated mining stations near the galactic rim. One moment it was sending regular reports. The next moment it simply wasn't there anymore. No distress signal, no wreckage, no energy readings that would indicate an explosion or attack. The ship and its crew of 12 artificial beings had simply ceased to exist, Confederate command assumed. It was a mechanical failure. Space was dangerous, and sometimes ships were lost to accidents or natural phenomena, but then a second ship disappeared. Then a third. When the fourth patrol went missing, Admiral Zixmora decided to investigate personally. She took her flagship and a squadron of heavy cruisers to the area where the ships had vanished. What they found there should have been impossible. Space itself looked wrong. Stars that should have been burning bright were dim and cold. Planets had changed position without any gravitational cause. And floating in the darkness were objects that hurt to look at directly. The objects were huge, larger than space stations. They seemed to be made of something that wasn't quite matter and wasn't quite energy. They moved in ways that violated every law of physics the Draconis Empire had ever discovered, and they looked exactly like the creatures from human mythology. Admiral Zixmora ordered her ships to open fire. The energy beams that could shatter moons struck the objects directly. For a moment the creatures seemed to pause, as if surprised. Then they began to move toward the fleet. "All ships retreat immediately," Admiral Zixmora commanded. But as her vessels turned to flee, she realized something that filled her with cold terror. The creatures were not chasing them. They were already ahead of them, waiting. The last transmission from Admiral Zixmora's flagship was just 4 words. The humans were right. The call went out across the galaxy within hours of Admiral Zixmora's last transmission. Every species that had ever dreamed of conquest, every empire that had never known defeat, every civilization that had stood for millions of years, they all answered. This was what they had built their fleets for. This was why they had created weapons that could crack planets and shields that had never been broken. An enemy had finally appeared that was worthy of their full attention. Council Prime Vexthara coordinated the response from the capital world. Her crystalline form blazed with light as she processed tactical data from 1,000 different species. Never in galactic history had so many civilizations worked together for a single purpose. 10 million ships, she announced to the assembled fleet commanders. Every vessel of war in the galaxy. Every weapon we have ever built. Every warrior who has ever drawn breath. The fleet that assembled at the edge of Confederate space was beyond imagination. Ships the size of cities floated next to others that existed partially in other dimensions. Some vessels were grown from living metal. Others were built from crystallized time itself. Admiral Veltar of the Void Hunters commanded the left flank. His people had never lost a battle in 50,000 years of warfare. Admiral Kexanin of the Star Shepherds took the right. Her ships could manipulate gravity itself as a weapon dot at the center. The new admiral of the Draconis fleet, Kulvex, led the charge. He had sworn to avenge Admiral Zixmora and restore his people's honor. His dreadnought alone carried enough firepower to sterilize a solar system. They moved toward the enemy with confidence that bordered on arrogance. How could anything stand against such a force? They were the masters of the galaxy, the inheritors of millions of years of technological advancement. The enemy was waiting for them. The creatures hung in space, like living nightmares made real. They were impossible to count because they seemed to exist in several places at once. Some looked like the dragons from human stories, massive serpents with wings that could blot out stars. Others resembled demons with too many arms and eyes that burned with cold fire. But the most terrifying thing about them was how familiar they looked. Every species in the galaxy had their own myths about monsters and devils, and every single one of those myths was represented in the enemy fleet. All ships, Admiral Kovacs commanded, open fire. The attack began with a light show that could be seen from other galaxies. Energy beams hot enough to ignite planets lanced through space. Missiles that could crack moons streaked toward their targets. Weapons that manipulated the laws of physics themselves unleashed forces that should have erased the enemy from existence. For 17 minutes, the greatest military force in galactic history poured destruction into the enemy fleet. The creatures absorbed it all. Worse than that, they seemed to learn from each attack. Energy beams that struck them were twisted and reflected back at the ships that fired them. Missiles were caught and transformed into something else entirely before being sent back at their creators. Admiral Veltar watched in horror as his flagships, main cannon, a weapon that could punch through any known shield, fired directly into what looked like a giant demon's mouth. The creature swallowed the energy beam, then breathed it back out as a wave of force that turned 3 of his cruisers inside out. "This is impossible," he whispered. But his ships were already dying around him. The creatures didn't just fight back, they fought in ways that made no sense. They moved through space as if it were water, ignoring the laws that said nothing. Could travel faster than light. They appeared in multiple places at once, attacking from directions that didn't exist. Some of the creatures reached out with what might have been claws and simply touched the Confederate ships where they touched. Reality seemed to break down. Ships didn't explode, they just stopped being ships and became something else instead. Admiral Kexanin tried to retreat with her remaining vessels, but the creatures were already behind her. Space itself seemed to fold around them, bringing the enemy from impossible distances in the blink of an eye. "All ships," she broadcast on the emergency channel. "They're not fighting us. They're playing with us." Back on the capital world, Council Prime Vexthara watched her people's greatest triumph turn into their worst nightmare. The tactical displays showed Confederate ships winking out of existence one by one. Not destroyed, simply gone, as if they had never existed at all. "How is this possible?" she asked her advisors. "We are the masters of this galaxy. We have conquered 1,000 worlds each. Our technology is beyond anything these creatures should understand." But even as she spoke, she remembered something that made her crystalline form dim with fear. The human ambassador had tried to warn them. He had spoken of creatures from mythology, beings that could do impossible things. She had dismissed him as a primitive fool. Now, as she watched her civilization's pride and joy being consumed by living nightmares, she realized the humans had known something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. The few ships that managed to escape brought reports that should have been impossible. The enemy creatures looked exactly like the monsters from each species' oldest myths. They fought using tactics that seemed to come from legend and folklore rather than military science, and strangest of all, they seemed to recognize the Confederate ships as if they had fought similar battles before long ago on Earth. President Young-Soo received an emergency communication from what remained of the Galactic Council. The message was brief and desperate. Request immediate assistance. Enemy force? Beyond our capabilities, humanity's warnings were correct. Young-Soo gathered his advisors in the deep bunkers beneath the capital. These were rooms that few humans knew existed, filled with technology that officially didn't exist. Sir, said Defense Minister Ki-young, our sensors are tracking the battle. The Confederate fleet is being destroyed. How long before the enemy reaches human space? Young-Soo asked. At their current rate of advance, maybe 2 weeks. But sir, if they could destroy the entire Confederate fleet in 17 minutes, what can we possibly do against them? Young-Soo was quiet for a long moment. Then he activated a communication system that hadn't been used in over 300 years. Send recall orders to all human ships. Bring everyone home immediately, and activate the deep archives. Sir? Ki-young asked. The deep archives have been sealed since the settlement of Earth. We don't even know what's in them anymore. We're about to find out, Young-Soo said grimly. Because if the old stories are true, those archives contain the only weapons that can fight what's coming. Dr. Mi-young was still in her laboratory when the emergency alerts began broadcasting across Earth. She and Dong-jun had been working around the clock, translating more and more of the ancient texts. What they had found was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. The texts weren't just myths or stories. They were instruction manuals, battle reports, technical specifications for weapons and tactics designed to fight creatures that existed beyond normal space and time. Look at this, Dong-jun said, showing her a translation he had just completed. This describes something called a reality anchor. It's supposed to keep the enemy from using their ability to change the laws of physics. Mi-young studied the text. It was written in symbols that predated any known human civilization, but somehow she could understand it perfectly, as if the knowledge was already there, waiting in her mind. And this one, she said, pointing to another section. It talks about genetic locks and awakening protocols, as if humans were designed to fight these things. They worked in silence. For several minutes, both afraid to say what they were thinking. Finally, Dong-jun spoke. Mi-young, what if humans aren't really from Earth? What if we came here to hide from these creatures? And what if we've been preparing for their return ever since? Before Mi-young could answer, her computer chimed with an incoming message. It was from the government's Deep Research Division, a department she hadn't even known existed. Dr. Mi-young, your expertise is required immediately. Please report to Facility 77 Alpha with all research materials. Clearance level, absolute. As she and Dong-jun gathered their materials, Mi-young noticed something odd. The ancient stone tablets they had been studying were warm to the touch, and the symbols carved into them seemed to glow faintly in the laboratory's dim light, as if they were waking up. The facility was hidden beneath a mountain range that most humans believed was just a natural formation. Dr. Mi-young and Dong-jun were escorted through tunnels that seemed to go down forever, past doors marked with symbols that looked familiar, but wrong somehow. How long has this place existed? Mi-young asked their guide, a quiet woman named Soo-jin who wore the uniform of Earth's deepest intelligence services. Since before we knew we built it, Soo-jin replied. The construction. Records go back to the early settlement period, but the architecture is much older. We think the first colonists found partial structures already here and simply finished them. They passed laboratories filled with equipment that hurt to look at directly. Some machines seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes could process, others hummed with energy that felt alive and intelligent. What is this place? Dong-jun whispered. The place where humanity keeps its real secrets, Soo-jin said. The things we've been hiding from ourselves for 300 years. President. Young-Soo was waiting for them in a room at the facility's heart. But he wasn't alone. Around the conference table sat people Mi-young recognized from news broadcasts, the heads of every major government on Earth, the commanders of human space forces, and several elderly individuals she had never seen before. Dr. Mi-young, Mr. Dongjun, the president said. Thank you for coming. I know this must be confusing, but we need your expertise more than you know. One of the elderly individuals, a woman whose eyes seemed far older than her face, spoke up. My name is Dr. Haewon. I believe you've been working with similar materials to what we have here. She gestured to the walls of the room. They were covered with displays showing ancient texts, archaeological artifacts, and star maps that seemed to shift and change as Mi-young watched them. Everything you've discovered is correct, Haewon continued. Humans are not native to Earth. We came here as refugees from a war that consumed entire galaxies. The myths and legends our ancestors passed down aren't stories, they're memories. Memories of what? Mi-young asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. The last war, President Young-soo said. The final battle between humanity's ancestors and the creatures that are now destroying the Confederate fleet. We didn't win that war, Dr. Mi-young. We barely survived it. The displays around the room came to life, showing images that made Mi-young's head spin. Ancient battlefields where humans fought creatures that defied description. Weapons that seemed to tear holes in reality itself. Ships that existed in multiple dimensions at once. Our ancestors developed tactics and technology specifically designed to fight enemies that don't follow normal rules, Haewon explained. They learned to fight impossibility with impossibility. Dongjun stared at a display showing what looked like human soldiers wielding weapons made of crystallized starlight. These images can't be real. Humans have never had technology like this, haven't we? Asked Dr. Yoon-ho, the facilities director. He activated another display, and suddenly Mi-young understood why the ancient texts had seemed so familiar. The symbols on the walls were glowing now, not with reflected light, but with something that came from within. And as they glowed, information began flowing into Mi-young's mind. Not learned information, but remembered information. As if it had always been there, waiting. Genetic memory, she whispered. The knowledge was encoded into our DNA. Every human carries it, Dr. Yoon-ho confirmed. But it's been locked away, buried so deep that most people never access it. The trauma of the last war was so severe that our ancestors decided to hide the memories until they were needed again. And now they're needed, President Young-soo said grimly. Because the creatures we've been running from for millions of years have found us. Meanwhile, in Earth's orbital shipyards, Captain Jae-wook was experiencing the strangest day of his military career. He had been recalled from his patrol duties and given command of ships he had never seen before. They didn't look like normal human vessels. They were sleek and dark, built from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their weapon systems were completely unfamiliar, but somehow Jae-wook knew exactly how to use them. Captain, Sojin called from her station. She had been assigned to his crew along with several other officers who had reported unusual sensor readings. These ship systems are responding to our thoughts as much as our controls. Jae-wook nodded. He had noticed the same thing. When he thought about changing course, the ship began to turn before he touched the navigation controls. When he considered weapon configurations, the displays showed him options he had never studied but somehow understood perfectly. It's like the ships were built for us specifically, said engineer Hyun-woo, studying the propulsion systems. Not just for humans in general, but for us personally. That's because they were, said a voice from the doorway. Commander Yoon-ji entered the bridge, wearing a uniform Jae-wook had never seen before. It was black with silver symbols that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Commander? Jae-wook asked. I thought you were assigned to deep space reconnaissance. I was, Yoon-ji said. But my real assignment was to wait for this day. Captain, these ships aren't new constructions, they're old. Older than human space civilization. We've been maintaining them in secret for 300 years, waiting for the enemy to return. She activated the main display, showing the ships' true specifications. The technology was beyond anything Jae-wook had thought humans possessed. Engines that could fold space-time, weapons that fired concentrated reality, shields that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. How is this possible? Sojin asked. Because our ancestors built them during the last war, Yinji explained. Before they came to Earth, before they decided to hide. These are the ships that held the line while humanity evacuated to safety. The implications hit Jae-wook like a physical blow. We're not explorers or colonists, we're soldiers. We've always been soldiers. Every human is, Eunji confirmed. The genetic locks are already beginning to open. Soon, everyone will remember what we really are. Back at the facility, Mi-young was experiencing memories that weren't her own. She saw vast battles fought across dimensions that shouldn't exist. She watched human warriors wielding weapons that turned myth into reality, fighting creatures that existed beyond normal space and time. The dragons in our stories, she said suddenly, they're real. But they're not our enemies, they're our weapons, Dr. Haewon smiled grimly. Very good. The creatures our ancestors fought could only be defeated by turning their own impossible nature against them. So humanity learned to create impossibilities of their own. The displays showed more images, human soldiers riding creatures that looked like the dragons from ancient stories. But these dragons were made of crystallized energy and controlled fire that could burn through the fabric of reality itself. Every myth, every legend, every story about heroes defeating monsters, President Young-soo said. They're all instruction manuals, battle tactics. Technical specifications for weapons we'll need to build again. But how? Dongjun asked. We don't have the technology to create things like this. We don't need to create them, Dr. Yunho sighed, activating yet another display. We just need to remember how. The images showed massive caverns beneath Earth's surface, filled with machines and weapons that had been waiting in darkness for millions of years. Some were ships similar to the ones Jae-wook was learning to command. Others were stranger. Weapons that looked like living creatures, machines that existed partially in dream and partially in reality. Our ancestors didn't just hide on Earth, Haewon explained. They turned it into a fortress, a hidden base of operations designed to launch the final counterattack when the enemy inevitably found us again. Mi-young felt the genetic memory stirring more strongly now. She could see the plan as her ancestors had conceived it. Earth wasn't just a refuge, it was a trap. A carefully prepared battleground where humanity would make their last stand. The enemy thinks they're hunting refugees, she said, understanding flooding through her. But we're not refugees anymore. We're the bait, President Young-soo nodded. And the trap is about to spring. Dr. Mi-young, Mr. Dongjun, we need you to help. U.S. translate the technical manuals. Commander Yoonji and Captain Jae-wook will lead our fleets. But we need everyone to remember their real purpose. As he spoke, alerts began sounding throughout the facility. The enemy fleet had entered human space. They would reach Earth within days, but this time humanity would be ready for them. This time, the children of the last war would remember who they really were. The transformation began at dawn on the third day after the enemy entered human space. Across Earth and every human colony, people woke up different. Not physically different, but changed in ways that went deeper than flesh and bone, factory worker. Kyung-min suddenly understood how to build weapons that could cut through dimensions. Teacher Yong-suk found herself able to read technical manuals written in languages that had never existed. Even children began drawing pictures of creatures and machines that looked like they came from humanity's deepest myths. Dr. Mi-young felt the change most strongly. As she worked to translate the ancient battle manuals, the symbols seemed to rearrange themselves into patterns her mind had always known. The genetic locks her ancestors had placed on human memory were opening all at once. It's like waking up from a dream that lasted 300 years, she told Dongjun as they worked in the underground facility. All this time, we thought we were explorers and scientists. But we're weapons. We were designed to fight these things. Above them, Captain Jae-wook was learning the same truth. His ships responded to his thoughts because they had been built by minds like his millions of years ago. Every human who sat at their controls found the same thing. The vessels weren't just tools. They were extensions of their will. Captain, Sojin reported from her station. I'm detecting massive movement in the underground caverns. Things are waking up down there. Jae-wook wasn't surprised. The genetic memories told him what was happening. All across Earth, ancient systems were coming online. Weapons that had slept in darkness for eons were stirring to life. How many ships do we have? He asked Commander Yoonji. More than the enemy knows, she replied. Our ancestors didn't just hide a few vessels here. They turned the entire solar system into a weapon. The first test came when the enemy's advanced scouts reached the outer planets. These were smaller creatures, things that looked like the demons and monsters from human horror stories. Fast, deadly, and able to exist in several dimensions at once, they expected to find a few primitive human settlements, easy prey for the main fleet to consume. Instead, they found Captain Jae-wook waiting for them. The battle was brief and terrible. The enemy. Scouts moved like living nightmares, phasing through normal matter and attacking from impossible angles. But Jae-wook's ships fought back with weapons that turned myth into reality. Energy beams that could track targets across multiple dimensions. Missiles that existed in the space between thoughts and dreams. Shields that protected not just against physical attacks, but against attacks on reality itself. When the scouts tried to change the laws of physics around them, the human ships simply ignored the changes. When they attempted to erase the human vessels from existence, the ships existed anyway, protected by principles that went deeper than normal reality. Impossible, one of the enemy creatures transmitted before it was destroyed. The children cannot have remembered so quickly. But Jae-wook heard something else in that transmission, fear. For the first time in millions of years, the ancient enemy was afraid. The main enemy fleet arrived 3 days later. Thousands of creatures that looked like every nightmare humanity had ever imagined, supported by ships that existed in dimensions normal minds couldn't comprehend. They found Earth's entire population waiting for them. The planet itself had changed. Mountains moved to reveal weapon emplacements that had been hidden for eons. The oceans drained into vast underground chambers, exposing machinery that covered the seafloor. Even the moon split open to reveal that it had never been a natural satellite at all, but a massive weapon platform. Citizens of Earth, President Young-soo broadcast to the world, today we remember who we are. Today we finish the war our ancestors started. The battle began in space, but it was fought across multiple realities simultaneously. The enemy creatures tried their usual tactics, changing the laws of physics, erasing their opponents from existence, attacking through dimensions that shouldn't exist, but humanity had learned to fight. Impossibility with impossibility. Dr. Mi Young, now serving as a tactical coordinator, guided weapons that existed more in myth than in matter. She called down dragons made of crystallized starfire to hunt the enemy's scouts. She summoned heroes from legend who wielded swords that could cut. The bonds between dimensions, the ancient stories weren't just memories, they were blueprints. Every fairy tale about defeating dragons, every legend about heroes facing impossible odds, every myth about the triumph of good over evil, contained literal instructions for weapons and tactics that could wound creatures beyond normal reality. Captain Jae-wook led the spaceborne assault, commanding fleets that moved like living things through the void. His ships didn't just fly, they swam through space-time itself, attacking from angles that made geometry weep. Engineer Hyun-woo had been transformed into something more than human, interfacing directly with weapons that responded to will and intention rather than mere technology. He called forth barriers that protected not just against physical attacks, but against the enemy's attempts to unmake reality itself. Marine Commander Yoonji led boarding parties armed with weapons that existed partially in dream and partially in nightmare. They fought the enemy creatures in hand-to-hand combat that took place across multiple dimensions, using techniques that had been encoded in human DNA for millions of years, but the most important battle was fought by the ordinary. Humans who had never trained for war. Factory workers who suddenly knew how to build impossible machines. Teachers who could read tactical manuals written before their species existed. Children who drew battle plans that made perfect sense to generals who had never seen them before. The enemy had expected to face the scattered survivors of a defeated race. Instead, they found themselves fighting the concentrated fury of an entire species that had been preparing for this moment. Since before recorded history began, the battle raged for hours that felt like years. Reality bent and twisted as too impossible. Forces clashed across multiple dimensions. Stars went dark and were reborn. Planets moved to positions that made better sense strategically. The very structure of space-time was rewritten to accommodate weapons that shouldn't exist, and slowly, inevitably, the ancient enemy began to retreat. They had won every battle for millions of years, by being more impossible than their opponents. But humanity had learned to be impossible in ways the enemy had never imagined. "Fall back," the enemy commander transmitted to its forces. "The children have become something new, something we cannot defeat." But Dr. Mi-young, reading the genetic memories that now flowed freely through her mind, knew the truth. "We haven't become something new," she said. "We've remembered what we always were." The final phase of the battle wasn't about destroying the enemy. That was impossible. Instead, it was about doing what humanity's ancestors had done before, binding them, banishing them, sealing them away where they could do no harm, using techniques that existed more in legend than in science. Humanity began to weave a prison around the ancient creatures. Not a prison of matter or energy, but one made of story and myth and the collective will of an entire species. The enemy fought against the binding, but they were weakened by their defeat and confused by humanity's impossible tactics. Slowly, inevitably, they were drawn back into the spaces between galaxies, sealed away by locks that would hold for another few million years. As the last of the creatures vanished into banishment, the galaxy fell silent. Council Prime Vexthara, watching from her war-torn capital world, transmitted a message to Earth. "We understand now. You were never the galaxy's newest members. You were its oldest guardians." President Young-Soo replied from Earth, which was slowly returning to its peaceful appearance as the hidden weapons sank back into concealment. "We are the children of the last war. We keep the watch so others may sleep safely. But remember this, the myths weren't just our history. They were our promise." In the months that followed, the galaxy rebuilt under humanity's quiet protection. The other species learned to listen when humans spoke of things that seemed impossible. They began to study human mythology not as primitive stories, but as the most advanced military doctrine ever developed. Dr. Mi-young established new schools where aliens could learn to recognize the signs of ancient threats. Captain Jae-wook trained the galaxy's defenders in tactics that went beyond normal military thinking and deep beneath Earth's surface. In caverns that officially didn't exist, humanity maintained its vigil. The weapons slept again, but lightly. The genetic locks remained open, ready to release their stored knowledge at a moment's notice, because the ancient enemy would return someday. They always did, but when that day came, the galaxy would be ready. The children of the last war would remember their purpose once again, and the myths would become reality once more.